We are here to have an intellect debate with James Marriott, the great James Marriott of the Times of London, who thinks that English literature is dead. And he wrote a very good piece about that in the New Statesman, which I'm sure you've all read, or it's been lots of extracts on Twitter have been going around. And I'm Henry Oliver. I write the Common Reader, and I'm going to take the optimistic position. But really, we're here to hear from James, so we're going to do that. We are recording. We are live streaming on Twitter or X or whatever. So if you don't want to be on the live stream, you can turn your video off. That's fine. But because you're here, you can ask questions. So you can put things in the chat. We will see what you're saying. We will bring that up, and we'll have a section at the end where you can ask James questions directly on camera yourself. So that'll be great. So James, do you want to start by giving us an overview of your position, like why English literature is dying, what exactly the problem is, and a sort of brief outline of where you think the future's going?
Yeah, of course. I guess the core of my argument is basically statistical. Uh, the idea that literature is dying has obviously been repeated by pessimistic misanthropes for a very long time, and which I think sometimes leads people to underrate the importance of the argument and what's going on. But I think the evidence we have now is really pretty compelling. I guess the wider problem is what we know is the decline of reading. There have been all kinds of interesting and really quite depressing surveys and studies on this in the last year or two. A lot of interesting work's been done on it. We know that more than a third of British adults who say they once read for pleasure have now given up. There was a report from the National Literacy Trust earlier this year, which found shocking and dispiriting falls in children reading for pleasure. Children's reading, as reported in these surveys, is now at its lowest level on record. The number of 8 to 18-year-olds reading for pleasure has halved in the last 2 decades. The most alarming aspect of all this is the recent report from the OECD, which found that literacy levels across the developed world were falling and stagnating, which is a genuinely remarkable thing to happen in a developed country. You'd assume that if your literacy levels are falling, something has gone catastrophically wrong. There's been a sort of terrible economic crash and the education system's collapsed. But this is happening in the majority of developed countries. Uh, we have all kinds of anecdotal evidence that's been collected in loads of sort of fascinating pieces in the Atlantic and the New Yorker about academics talking about how they think that their students can no longer read books, even their English literature students are struggling to read books. From my conversations with academics, even at Oxbridge, I've heard similar things. I guess if we're going to get specifically into English literature, which was the subject of my piece in the New Statesman, um, this is another story that's about, I think, about 10 years old. This decline has been going on. When I did English literature at A level in terrifyingly 2011, it was still the most popular A level subject. More people did it than any other subject. It's now not even in the top 10. So English literature as a subject has really fallen from what I think, if you're of a certain generation, you assume it's one of the sort of automatic pillars of the curriculum. Most people will do it somewhere along the way. That's no longer the case. And it's also really begun to fall at university. The figures are a bit harder to get for universities because people study English literature in various configurations with various names and titles. When I did my master's in English, it was called Issues in Modern Culture, which is the kind of thing, if degrees have weird names like this, they're harder to collect for surveys. But we think the English literature at university has fallen by about a third in that period. And we certainly know that a number of universities, including Kent, Canterbury, and Sheffield Hallam, have closed their English programs. So I don't know, that's the sort of dry statistical case for this is happening, this is a thing. Reading is declining, the study of literature is declining. And I guess the piece I wrote in the New Statesman was using I have to say, very long and not always like laugh a minute book by Stefan Collini that was very comprehensive about the history of English literature as a subject. And the one of the things that book really did highlight was how much more culturally central English had once been. And I guess my review was a sort of opportunity to remark on the disparity of the position of literature in our culture. Uh, in the years of the triumph of English literature. Its kind of golden age was probably after the Second World War in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, versus where it is now, which is sort of, I think, really in crisis.
Okay. Um, Very good. Everyone's now thoroughly depressed and looking forward
That's
to
my
the
job. I like depressing people.
this is the end of civilization. Let me I'm going to do a series of challenging questions, and then you can tell us what you think about that before we open up to to viewers. One thing I would sort of like to ask you is, like, let's assume this is all true. English literature is in massive decline as an academic subject. Is this a bad thing in the sense that these young people are now studying, I don't know, computer science or psychology or business, or they're doing something, right? They're still going to university, they're still doing a degree. Um, and English graduates, I'll take the devil's advocate position. I'm not necessarily saying I believe all of this. What are they good for? They don't understand economics. They don't understand how business works. Their political opinions are like vague and feely and hand wavy. They haven't actually done a great job of like running the country or running anything. They lack critical thinking skills. Like,
Unable to post live links to a
I mean,
simple
you should have
intellect debate on
seen
Twitter.
us trying to sort this. 10 minutes we're sitting there going,
I posted it. I'm an English
no,
major.
you posted it, but the
One
rest of
out of
us,
three English majors can
indeed. But
reassure.
you see
Yeah.
what I'm saying? Like, people will still study Shakespeare and Chaucer. We will lose English departments, but we won't lose the degree. Like Oxford, Cambridge, London, Edinburgh, Bristol, the major departments will still exist. How much does it really matter if people are just doing other subjects now?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I agree with you insofar as I agree that English literature, and it's often forgotten as a relatively recent invention as a subject.
Mm.
It sprung up in Oxford and Cambridge at the beginning of the 20th century, spread to other universities. When it started, it was viewed as a ludicrous soft option. There was a lot of grumbling from classics departments about how stupid it was that people would study literature in their own language. Why do you need to study that? You can just pick up a book and read. Its apogee, I guess, was pretty long. People were a lot of people studied English between about 1935 and 2015. That's an awful lot of people studied English. But it is true that it's never been a historic centerpiece of the university. Uh, it's probably, there seems to be a thing where a sort of humanities subject takes the central position of a university, and kind of that seems to embody the values of where a society is. So, in the Middle Ages,
Mm-hmm.
theology was the queen of the science. Was it the queen of the sciences they called theology? I think actually the take up of theology in the Middle Ages was never quite as enormous as some of the mythology would leave you to believe. But theology and law were central to medieval universities. In the 19th century, of course, classics became the thing that people studied at university. And you can make arguments, as I do in the piece, that that reflected the kind of the values of Victorian civilization, its interest and curiosity about Western civilization, justifications for colonialism, an interest in a kind of long Western heritage of a superior tradition that was embodied by classics. English took over in the 20th century. I think arguably English is now losing its place and its cultural prestige to subjects like psychology, perhaps. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's notable that once upon a time you might have gone to a dinner party and been expected to be au fait with the latest, book, a shortlisted novel. I don't think that's the case anymore, but I do think in similar university educated groups, a kind of familiarity with the language of psychology and therapy and
Mm-hmm.
things like that might have an equivalent social
Yeah.
capital. And I think that's displaced English. And a lot of people who did English because they were interested in people are now doing psychology. So
the
if
way
it
the way
was
I say that to people is in a previous generation, everyone would have known some Dickens characters. And you would have been able to talk about a Mr. Micawber, and everyone would sort of have that as a shorthand for a particular type of person. Whereas now everyone knows from Malcolm Gladwell's books what a connector is or what a maven is.
Yeah, it's an
And
extremely good point. And it serves
that's the change, yeah.
those two languages serve a similar purpose, which is to
Yeah.
interpret the sort of psychological and aspects of the environment around you, the personalities you encounter. Uh, and yeah, so I think there's that factor. I think the reason it bothers me is because I don't think this is the case that we have swapped one subject for another and people are equally intellectually engaged with long books, which I think is an important part of, which has been an important part of our culture since the 18th century. And I think sadly, an important part of what's happening to English literature is that it's not just the victim of changing notions of cultural capital and cultural prestige, but it is the victim of a wider trend, which is what really is looking like the decline of literacy. And it's not that people are only not studying English because they've moved on to different kinds of books, and that's a sort of knowledge and way of interpreting society that no longer seems relevant. It's because they're just not reading books at all. And that's
Yeah.
pretty worrying.
Let me pick up on that because you made a point in your opening remarks about um, seeing these levels of literacy falling. The data is quite shocking. You would expect that to be in a civilization where there's some kind of economic collapse or educational collapse. So why is it, do you think, like I find this genuinely puzzling. If things are as bad as we're told, why isn't that showing up in the broader data? Like if because the data is pretty similar in America, right? About people not reading books and so forth. But they're not in a kind of economic catastrophe because no one can read. Um, like, why isn't this feeding through into any other area of life?
It's a good point. I mean, I would say the way that it is feeding through into our life is into our political life. There's a brilliant book that I'm obsessed with, and I suspect most people here are familiar with, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which is a sort of very, I think, prophetic and very depressing tract about the rise of television I think it was published in the late 80s. And
Mm-hmm.
his case is basically that our democracy is not a kind of abstract historical virtue that's arrived out of history from nowhere. Modern democracy, as we know it, is a phenomenon of the highly literate culture of the 19th century. And democracy, as we know it, grew up and could only have been born and nurtured in a heavily print-focused environment in which political debates were playing out in books
Mm-hmm.
and in newspaper articles. Postman is extremely good in the virtues of print as a medium for political debate. He says that it has a sort of a formal and distancing tone, inevitably, that cools the temperature of debate. When you make an argument in print, you have to make an argument. You can't just assert things. You can't just shout opinions. Print demands that you explain yourself to some degree in a logical manner. And I guess if I were to, and his argument in the book is that the advent of television heralded the decline of political culture because TV just can't sustain democratic culture in the way that a print culture can. I would argue that we're seeing that happening right in front of us. Donald Trump to me seems the archetypal politician of the age of amusing ourselves to death. I think that's where we're seeing it in terms of our politics. I guess, whether it matters economically that people are not reading long novels is a different question. It seems hard if we're literally finding that literacy is declining, that people are getting worse at reading and interpreting long text. It seems hard to imagine that wouldn't, at some level, play out in economic data. But I think also that
But where? So that's what I'm saying. Like, where is? Let's cover the politics point separately, because I think if what you're saying was true, it should be showing up in other ways, right? How long will it
um,
take? How long will it take for some kind of like if you have a literacy problem and you're saying, well, that causes a political problem, but like it doesn't affect the growth rate. That just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So
I mean,
when will it have a broad effect on society?
I don't think the value of everything can be reduced purely to economics, but I think it's worth emphasizing this
No,
is
but
still pretty
if
recent.
everyone was reading at the like level of a 10-year-old, it would become very difficult to run like major corporations, right? Like
Yes, that's true. And I mean that's clearly not the point that we're at yet. I think the sort of the point that's perhaps worth emphasizing is that the more severe declines and more alarming declines, the things measured in the OECD data are pretty recent. These are the last kind of 5, 10 years.
Mhm.
For me, the really baleful moment is the advent of the iPhone, which I think is what precipitates a lot of this decline of reading, kind of supercharges that culture of trivial amusement, which is damaging our
Yeah,
politics. And this is a story at which we're still at the beginning of it. A lot of people make the point about the advent of the printing press, which is that its political effects and its economic effects took a while to filter through. You don't you get to the
sure,
Reformation
sure, sure.
70 years after the printing press. I think because when we look at the past, we tend to see events collapse together somewhat, and we forget that you know there are still generations of people who grew up in what was still broadly a print, a more print culture than one we have it now. These things take a while to filter through.
But those people also grew up in a TV culture, right? Like one thing, then another I think challenge to this thesis is that the people who are most concerned about what's happening are the people who spent their childhood in front of the box. One way that I see this come up, a sort of contradiction in this come up, is that I know a lot of women of my age who don't want their children to watch Disney films because the princess is like a bad feminist role model. You shouldn't be showing girls the Disney princess. And I'm like, but you all spent your lives watching the Disney princess and turned out, you know what I mean? Like it clearly didn't like do that much harm to our whole, like it's fine. And isn't there something here about a whole load of people saying TV is bad for democracy? But it just wasn't, it didn't damage my generation. We were fine watching, I can't remember what it is, but it was like 3 hours a day or whatever. It's like the average for kids in the 80s and 90s. Well, TV in America has been quite widespread since the 50s and 60s. So is the case not sort of too overstated? Like 20th century democracy didn't really seem to go wrong because of television.
I think I would disagree with that. In his book, Postman talks about uh, political figures like Reagan, who, with the benefit of hindsight to us, seem fairly benign, but from the perspective of Neil Postman, seemed like a falling off in terms of the intellectual level of the debates which politics was and the debates going on in politics. We shouldn't let the fact that
But
Donald
people,
Trump,
people,
who to me
people's.
seems to be the kind of, ultimate post-literate politician, blind ourselves to the fact that I think it is true that, I'm not saying television destroyed democracy in the 20th century, but I do
Sure,
think
sure.
it exerted a negative influence on it. And these things just take a while to filter
But
through. We could be having this
people over.
debate
Hang on. Yeah,
30
yeah.
years after the invention of the printing press and,
No,
the
no,
Civil Rights
sure.
Reformation.
No,
Society takes a while to metabolize these things.
I take that point, but television moves and influences a lot quicker, right? You can get a TV into like everyone's house within a 10 or 15-year period. Um, people were alarmist about it at the time. I think the thing about Reagan, though, that's where I think the argument's overstated because people were calling Reagan stupid right from the beginning. And in hindsight, like either he wasn't stupid or it didn't matter, right? And there is some data, obviously not like brilliant data, but there is some data that shows that the more educated a president is, the kind of the worse the outcome. So someone like Harry Truman, who like grows up on the farm, doesn't get a whole lot of schooling, right, is basically as uneducated as a president get. He turns out to be a pretty good president. Like that works great. Whereas someone like Woodrow Wilson, who has got like more degrees, it's like a whole stack of degrees. He's just a terrible president, and that just does not work very well. And there's a funny
Yeah,
little
although
graph where the funny little graph shows an inverse relationship to presidential education and what they call eminence, which is basically historians saying how good of a president they were. So it's obviously a little bit of a finger in the air, but it doesn't really seem to be the case that like the presidents who can have these like sophisticated, clever, well-informed debates are actually the best decision makers. Are actually sort of the coolest head to have in the situation room or whatever. What do you think about that? That like maybe what Neil Postman's saying is true. Maybe there is more like jackass talk at presidential debates, but it just doesn't actually matter that much. Like it doesn't matter as much as we thought it would.
I disagree. I mean, I guess the point is, and it's important not to conflate education with intelligence or depth of reading. A lot of these sort of less educated presidents were extremely well read and were saturated in a print culture. I guess the reason that Postman picks on Reagan as the transformational figure is that he was a former actor who I think actually was not a
Yeah.
particularly deep reader or thinker. I mean, he was a brilliant performer and has been praised for that. But I do think it's not wrong to identify him as the kind of harbinger of a more glib, more image-focused kind of politics. And perhaps at the time it seemed relatively harmless, and perhaps in hindsight he seems like a harmless figure. But I do think there's a trend going on here.
Um, what do you think about the idea? Because I don't like Neil Postman, but I do actually sympathize with the argument that like television was a bad idea and maybe we shouldn't have done it. But what do you think about the idea that, for example, the polarization of the 90s in the American Congress, which is sort of where modern polarization begins and becomes fierce and ridiculous and very extreme. Okay, maybe that was caused by like Fox News and whatever else. But they had that in the 1810s and the 1820s, right? And they were all calling each other out for duels and publishing slanders about who'd slept with a slave and who'd done this. And like, actually, it was a kind of much wilder and more, when you read it, it's like much more insane political culture than ours. What do you think about the idea that like this is just part of the cycle of human society, and um, we will always go through periods of just being morons and having low quality politicians and yelling at each other, and the technologies we have, they might make that happen in a different way. They probably modern technologies are making it worse, making it quicker, like making it more intense. Clearly, I'm not trying to claim that we don't live in like difficult political times or whatever. But what do you think of the idea that fundamentally what's happening is just something that does happen a lot in politics, and we're unused to it because we were lucky enough to live through a very calm and well-ordered period for a long time?
Yeah, no, I think there's certainly truth in that. This guy DJ is making some good points in the chat by the side I can see, by the way,
I'm going to come in
about
after you've answered this one. We're going to go through the whole chat, and
I mean, God, I don't want to get too, I'm not a 19th century historian. I'm just an opinion columnist, and all I have is my big mouth and my loud opinions. I guess, anybody who tries to talk about the importance of changing media it always ends up being accused of being a technological reductionist. It was the sort of insult that was thrown at Elizabeth Eisenstein, who, was the first, or, a major figure in bringing the history of the book and the invention of printing to the fore as an important factor in cultural and social and scientific change. I'm not a technological reductionist. I think the 2008 financial crash would have had an impact on our politics anyway. I think the rise of China would have had an impact on our politics
yeah,
anyway. The offshoring of American manufacturing jobs
yeah,
would have had an impact on our politics anyway.
9/11, things like that.
It's impossible to reduce the history of modern politics to any one cause outside of an opinion column, where of course I did all the time. But I think it's equally true to say that it's equally wrong to say that technology plays no role. I think the invention of the internet is on a level with the invention of the printing press, which we just know transformed the society into which it arrived. It transformed science, transformed culture, it transformed religion. I mean, we're still somewhat groping in the dark. The more I read about it, the more I think this is early days of the internet.
Oh,
We're still
sure.
living
Yeah.
in the kind of legacy years of the print culture that prevailed in Europe for the last, what, like 500, 600 years. So I don't want to make any kind of big claims about where I think it's going, but I do think it's transformative. And I do think the decline of reading, which there are all kinds of measures, which I find very plausible, that seems like it's going to be a big part of the story. And what's kind of interesting and I guess depressing about the decline of English literature is that this seems like a canary in the coal mine. This little yellow bird that's kind of fallen on its face in its cage. And I think that's one of those symptoms we can look at and say something is changing in our culture here. That's why it fascinates me.
What do you think of the idea that we've hit the bottom and we might stay at the bottom for a little while, but basically we've seen that reading will fall off, and we've seen that children will be on a screen all day if you let them, and we've sort of we're starting to adjust to the reality that you're describing, and we're going to start actually seeing a recovery, and we may not get back to what it was like in the 90s when we were young, but as you say, we still don't quite know what we're doing with the internet, and in 10 or 15 years, when we've got a bit more understanding, there will actually be a better balance and more reading overall. And, partly thanks to people like you saying, we shouldn't really let this get any worse. This does seem like an experiment we don't want to run. Actually, we might be about to, start going back up. What do you think of that?
I mean, I'd like to believe that. It sounds a bit optimistic to me. It sounds a little bit like there's a wonderful. I was reading a wonderful quotations about scribes working in their scriptoria about the advent of printing, and it's a bit like saying people will always want illuminated manuscripts. They're a foundation of Christianity. The beauty of the decorated text, hand inscribed by a scribe in a monastery, is a vital part of our culture. I think people always want that. It didn't turn out to be true. Um, I think also if you refer to people like us worrying about it, the voices of people who have, platforms in the media and who care about what is basically an elite culture have never been less relevant than they were. That's partly thanks to the internet. I'm pretty pessimistic. I don't really see how we maintain anything like the culture of reading that once existed, even in its kind of shadow form. I guess the thing that we're seeing at the moment a little bit is I think there is a backlash to some degree among intelligent people who kind of remember pre-iPhone life and
Mm.
can understand and grasp sort of how horrifying the universal hypnotism of everybody in the tube is by like these totally, I mean, God, I'm going to sound like such a sort of, don't sound too snobbish, but like it's really kind of trivial. In my view, it's really kind of alarmingly trivial and depressing stuff to feed into your brain. And I think there are people who get that and who are worried by it and will not want their children to have it and will not want it themselves. And you see these people, they all read your Substack, reading Middlemarch, and I think they're conscious of the media change that we're going on, and we're worrying about it, and we want to do something about it. I think that's probably a minority movement. I mean, a theory that has been put to me that I'd be interested to see if it plays out is that there will be a sort of emerging class divide in this stuff, whereby if you're
Mm.
lucky enough to grow up with nice middle class parents who ban you from your phone, don't let you play video games, and force you to read Harry Potter and Narnia, you get a better chance. You'll get a much better chance in life than someone whose, mum or dad is working like multiple jobs and the options and the kind of latitude to entertain you with stuff other than an iPhone is just much more diminished. And I think we're actually already seeing that sort of exacerbated divide opening up. But I just kind of, yeah, reality privilege, the phrase in the chat is a good one. But I just think in the longer term, I'm kind of skeptical. It's us versus these enormous Silicon Valley companies that have trillions and trillions of dollars pouring through them and are highly motivated to outcompete all other forms of entertainment other than apps and iPhone stuff. They've done an exceptionally and I think really quite alarmingly good job now. I don't think if we'd been having this conversation 20 years ago, we would have predicted that reading would have fallen off in the way that it has and that people would be spending so much time with forms of entertainment that are really so alarmingly trivial.
Oh, but
And
people were making that prediction. People were saying exactly what you're saying because of television.
yeah, I agree. I'm not sure we'd have thought it would have been so like I don't know, God, I'm going to sound like such a kind of snooty person saying this, but I just like people playing Candy Crush Saga and all these kind of things on the tube, like the inanity of some of this stuff, I think we'd have found it hard to predict. But big tech companies are highly incentivized and have a lot of money to outcompete all of the forms of entertainment, and they're doing it. And I don't quite see how that process, which seems like a kind of historical economic process, can be stopped.
Okay. I am going to look through the chat and we are going to deal with some of the comments there. So DJ says everyone knows who Homer Simpson is, which I guess is in response to the Dickens Malcolm Gladwell thing. That's a good point. Like, I don't believe in the golden age of TV. I don't think The Sopranos and Mad Men were this like one. Like, if that's the peak of TV, TV is clearly a failed medium in my eyes. But what do you think about the fact that there is actually like decent screen stuff, right? It's not all Candy Crush or whatever else is giving you an apoplectic fit in the mornings. There is decent TV. I mean, how do you feel about the relative merits of different things that people are doing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, one has to kind of be a little bit hypocritical here. I love The Simpsons. Uh, I briefly, as a kind of cultural experiment, had TikTok, and I found some of the stuff on it like funny and clever and witty. I don't think the fact that I think these things are bad for us means that they're like universally culturally worthless. Neil Postman makes the point in his book that he's not worried about kind of he's not worried about trash TV. There's always been like, trash in our culture. The kind of frightening stuff is the political stuff. Like the frightening stuff is the way that that politics gets sort of distorted into another form
Mm.
of entertainment. And I think
So
something.
hang on, you're saying it's not the introduction of a new type of lowbrow trash, it's the degradation of something that used to be kept on a much higher plane and conducted in print and had higher standards.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. But I think also perhaps the element of it that Neil Postman would have failed to predict is like the level to which the bad stuff could just proliferate, push out the good stuff. And I think stuff like, if literacy is declining, that's an OECD report. This isn't just kind of, this isn't just some survey.
Sure.
That's pretty serious. And I think then you have to say, okay, well, maybe some of these TikToks are funny and well made, but maybe that's just not, maybe that is still bad in itself, which I think Neil Postman may not have gone quite that far. He was kind of open to trash TV, I think, at least in principle.
Sure. So Eloy has said to me, what about Disraeli or Churchill? Meaning, I think that they were good prime ministers, but who were novelists and intellectuals and so forth. I don't think Disraeli was a good prime minister. And I think historians have. Let me tell you this. If you read a biography of Disraeli after the Boris Johnson premiership, you see the alarming parallels and you see what a huckster and a chancer and a no good that Disraeli was. So I take him as evidence of my thesis. Churchill's interesting because he's exactly what James was saying. He did not go to university, but he was incredibly well read, a serious autodidact, used to go home and read Gibbon in the evenings, all this sort of thing, which one cannot imagine Keir Starmer going home to read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. But maybe it would make enlightening reading for him. But I actually don't. I don't think Churchill's as good as his reputation suggests. And without the Second World War, he would be widely regarded as bad news, as he was by his contemporaries. So I think I'm just going to put him as a special case.
Can I just? I know this is turning into like those Joe Rogan episodes where everyone says that Churchill was bad and should have lost the Second World War. Actually, I'm not going that far. I'm a fellow Churchill skeptic.
No, to be clear, I
not
think
that that's a well-informed opinion at all.
I think he did a good job in the war overall, and I'm not saying he should have lost.
Yeah, no, I think we can probably agree on that somewhat.
Yeah. His reputation has got a sort of golden shimmer over it because of.
But I do think if we start dissing Churchill a bit, this is the path to many more views than discussing the decline of the English literature degree.
All right, let's just trash
this may
Churchill
be a fruitful.
This may be a fruitful
pattern. This may be a fruitful strand to pursue.
Well, I can go ahead. He made a terrible decision about going back on the gold standard. He ignored specialist advice. He was clear. He took gifts from people all over the place. He was clearly conflicted, just in hundreds of ways. All of his colleagues thought he was unreliable, flimsy with the truth. He attended an actual police operation and put himself in harm's danger and put officers in harm's danger. Like he was just a loose cannon all the way through. And everyone knew it. He was also an incredible racist. Like he was, by the standards of his time, he was just far more racist than everyone else. He was absolutely demented about the issue of India. So I'm gonna put Churchill in the box of like, the war came along and really saved that guy.
I mean, the wider point there is, I guess, that I think we're probably not going to persuade everyone that Churchill was a bad prime minister, but there is not an inevitable correlation between literacy and political success. I'm not saying it's that simple. I think it's more cultural. Sure. I think it's more a cultural thing.
And we should point out he was prime minister twice, and the second time, as my children say, he really sucked. So it's this one premiership we look at. DJ says it's not just about presidents. TV has definitely degraded Congress. I would actually probably agree with that, and I think it's done the same to the House of Commons, and they're having the cameras on all the time.
Disaster.
Yeah, and I would say that's where the Postman thesis applies the most. Actually, the average legislator has become more of a talk show person. Reagan had good advisors. Exactly. I don't know how much TV affects the quality of the advisor. So Kate says the question of critical inputs into a democracy and whether they're enhanced or not by a medium is more to do with the means of control. So increased information access via TV, social media has helped with inclusion, but consolidated ownership of distribution channels prioritizes the profit incentive, which is bad. And so if literature, quote unquote, matters, it's because it's training people's attention away from these sort of monetizable mediums. I guess you agree with that, right? That's sort of broadly what you're saying.
Yeah,
Silicon Valley companies,
yeah.
Okay. Book talk, the revival of reading culture among the young. I take this quite seriously, and I think it's like actually a good thing that people on 4chan discuss, reading Dostoevsky or whatever, and is quite literally what all the people, all the literature people who write op-eds in the New York Times complaining about like the novel and the state of democracy or whatever, they quite literally say things like young male Trump voters should read Margaret Atwood. And then when we find, the 4chan forums lighting up with discussion of Dostoevsky, no one seems to think that's good news. What do you think about that, James?
I mean, you'll be unsurprised to learn that I'm a skeptic about this as well. I think book talk is much overdone. I think in the vast kind of sewage pit of TikTok, which is just broiling with nonsense, I just think book talk is such a minor phenomenon. It comes to the attention of people in the mainstream media and people in the traditional press because it's something that we understand. It's kind of curious that books are flourishing on TikTok. We can get our heads around that. We know what books are. It in itself is a somewhat unexpected story. I'm profoundly skeptical that this is a major part of TikTok and what people are doing on TikTok. I think if you were to weigh up the damage that TikTok has had on a culture of reading versus the virtues of book talk, I think it's pretty obvious which way that, putting those two things in the scale, which way that turns out. I also, uh, I know I'm just going to go into my snobby rant again. I also feel like
Great.
I am very unpersuaded by the quality of reading that is being promoted on Book Talk. And I just think maybe it would be better if we're reading novels, like actual long novels, rather than, whatever dragons having, not to caricature it, but like, naughty dragons or whatever's the thing nowadays.
Tyson
That's my
Duffy.
that's my skeptical take.
No, I get it. I get it. Tyson Duffy has made what I think is an excellent point and is very under discussed. That there was a Gallup poll, I assume he's just pulled this at random as an example, from 1955, showing that 39% of Americans read a book that year, i.e., the same problem that you are seeing today. I would make the broader point that we just don't have enough good comparable data, and we don't really know. We know that like there's been a decline since 1998 or 2002 or whenever these polls start, but we don't really know how this compares to like the longer 20th century. And the example I would give is that like my parents read a few books every year. My grandparents didn't really read books. And I think that's not an unusual pattern. There are a lot of people who left school at 14. Many of them read books all their life, many of them didn't. What do you think of the idea that like I think this is Tyson's broader point. We just don't have enough good data to know whether this is like a real decline or just the way things have been for a while actually.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a reasonable point, and I guess one response would be that a lot of people are reading a lot more newspapers and magazines, and a lot of the stuff published in newspapers and magazines is much more long form than it is today. So
Mm-hmm.
a reading culture is not just necessarily about people reading books. I suspect the people who were reading books were reading many more books than they are nowadays. I mean, the data we do have seems to show that's the case, and I guess I'm not saying, I think it would be ludicrous for me to say that the only way we can have a functioning democracy is if everybody reads loads all the time. That's a preposterous. I mean, it would be a society I'd love to live in. I think as a realistic vision of society, it's preposterous, has never happened, and will never happen. But I do think you need, I guess, concentrated reading among thoughtful, intelligent people who debate politics, who decide policy, who legislate. And I think some of that has to leak out into the wider culture. I'm not saying that everybody has to read Dickens. That would be, that really would be lovely but mad. So I guess, yeah, I am guilty of over romanticizing the past, but I want to say that, like, I'm not kind of envisaging some kind of crazy utopia.
Mm. Trey says that I've clearly never seen The Wire. He's quite right, and I'm not going to see it. I've tried too many of these shows that are supposed to be a double plus, 5 star, and they're utterly mediocre, and I'm done. I tried Succession. They told me it was like King Lear. That was a lie.
I do love Succession. I think there's
Oh,
plenty of good
James, so you're
television.
part of the problem. You
Yeah,
come
but
on
I
here
mean,
telling us
hypocrisy.
civilization's on fire, and then you love Succession.
I know. I mean, I've got to say, hypocrisy is a privilege of writing opinion columns. My thoughts are not yet systematized into an overall scheme. They come in bits and pieces.
Okay, in a minute we will open it up to questions. You can obviously keep putting your questions in the chat, and I will look at that In a minute, if you click the react button at the bottom, you can do raise hand. This dreadful little emoji hand comes up. That way, we can ask you to say your question and you won't all be talking over each other. Um, I'm going to ask James a final question before we come to your questions. So start hitting the hand emoji now or thinking up what you want to ask James and putting it in the chat. Okay, let's just say you're right. You know, things are very bad and it's going to have these ramifications. Um, I think there's too much of this kind of complaining among what you might call literary elites. And I want you to tell us what we can do to make things better, even if we accept your point that they're not going to get much better and it's still going to become a minority thing and whatever. What is the if people are listening to you thinking, oh my God, he's right, you know, it's over, it's over. What can we do to sort of improve things? Well, in our lives, how can we make some sort of good difference?
Yeah, it's a good point. And obviously, complaining is such a fruitful thing to do as a columnist. And, I noticed that I can reliably get a lot of people to like a tweet which says how dreadful everything is and
Indeed,
how
yes.
nobody's reading anymore. I think the other part of the equation is enthusiasm. If we like books, we have to be enthusiastic about them and we have to promote them. I think one of the things I spoke about this with you and we did another podcast together is that literature has to seem like a statusful activity. It shouldn't seem like a worthy, boring, or naff thing to do. It's thrived throughout history and has attracted people to it because it seemed exciting. And I think we have to sort of, to the degree that we can, promote the idea of reading books as an extraordinary activity that gives you a wider, deeper, broader picture of the world that's inaccessible by any other means, and that the people who are capable of doing that are really getting something in life that other people can't get. I think that's very important. I think we have to insist that it's better, which is why I'm so down on TikTok. 'Cause I think we have to say this stuff is better, and we've got to disseminate that idea as far as we can. I mean, I think there is other stuff. I'm very heartened that the government is launching this year of reading next year in 2026. And I think there is stuff that can be done in schools. I visited a school.
What is the year of reading?
I'm not precisely sure what the details are yet, but there's going to be a kind of nationwide push for everyone, I think especially kids, to read more. And I think there are initiatives that can work. I was at a school a few weeks ago where all the kids lined up before school, and they had to have three things in their hands. They had to have their sort of folder. They had to have I think whatever the relevant textbook. They had to have their folder, their pencil case, and they all had to have the book they were reading for fun before they walked into school. All the staff, whenever they sent an email, in their email sign off, they had to say what book they were reading.
Mm,
The library was filled with books, not with computers. I think stuff like that can make a difference. And,
mm, mm.
I think we're sometimes in danger of talking about reading and literature as if it's like trying to make people eat broccoli. I think it is good. And I think good books, if you can get them into people's hands and you can get them the attention span and the space to encounter them, make an argument for themselves. Like literature's, it's extraordinary. There is no experience like reading a great novel. There is no experience like reading a brilliant history book. That's just a sort of depth and richness of understanding of the world and life that is just not available anywhere else. Nowhere else does it. And I do think there's an argument that to some degree, if you can get this amazing thing into people's hands and give them space to appreciate it, they will appreciate it. But the first part of that is a huge challenge, in my
Okay,
view.
so James Marriott says, "Don't read a book to save democracy. Read it because it's bloody good fun."
And to save democracy.
Bit of both. Okay. Tell us, you do good book recommendations every Friday on Substack. Tell
Yes.
us tell us what you've read. Give us some recommendations so people can go on Amazon and order it while you talk.
Oh God. What have I read lately that's been
What
good?
have
I
you
mean,
read?
so the book that I'm reading at the moment, and it's kind of somewhat to my amazement, I tweeted about it and 10,000 people liked the tweet, which was Fernand Brodel's The Structures of Everyday Life, which is a kind of social history of Europe, which is brilliant and
And it's
evidently,
a sort of economic history, right? It's about
yeah,
how,
sort of the technically it's an economic history.
yeah,
I mean, it's sort of fascinating on daily life, on how people lived, on how agriculture worked, where they were moving,
yeah.
how populations were expanding and declining, how urbanization happened. There was sort of this amazing enthusiasm for it on Twitter. I think it might be a book that people who do history read at university. And I think, I might have touched something that a lot of people knew about. That's brilliant. I'm reading, appropriately enough, a very good book on the subject that we're talking about, The Gutenberg Parenthesis by Jeff Jarvis.
Oh, that is a good book. Yes.
And his sort of thesis is that the sort of period that we're exiting, so the sort of period from the early 15th century to now,
Mm,
was defined by print, the proliferation of print, And we are kind of in an analogous position to the people who watched print arrive in their culture.
Yeah.
We're watching it depart. And, he to some degree asks whether the culture will return to will be one that looks a bit more like the one before print arrived. How might it look different? It's a very good, it also just works as a very good overview of like the history of printing, its dissemination in culture. If you can't be bothered to read Elizabeth Eisenstein's book about the cultural impact of printing, he whisks you through it. He talks about all the other people I'm interested in this subject. Walter Ong, brilliant book, Orality and Literacy, but Jeff Jarvis summarizes it very well. Eric Havelock, these kind of Marshall McLuhan, these sort of titans of, the study of print and literacy. But there's slightly wordy recommendations, I'm afraid.
But no, that's a good one because that book is a sort of primer for all the issues you've been discussing, isn't it?
Yes, I think if you want to get your head around this whole thing, that's a pretty good place to start. I also started reading rereading Vanity Fair by Thackeray last night, but I've got no idea whether I'll actually read the whole thing. I was kind of testing whether I can, make the commitment.
That's one of those classics that I don't love. I find that a bit boring.
Yeah, I loved it in my teens, but I'm kind of, I don't know. I'm coming back to it now. I'm going to see how I feel about it.
Well, we'll see what happens. Okay, we've got DJ with his hand up before we go to the written comments.
Thanks, everyone. This is a great discussion. I guess there's sort of two things I want to raise. So one is, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I'm one of the old Gen Xers here. And there was sort of a quality of TV back then as moral instruction, right? So I can't speak to what was playing in the UK, but we had, the Norman Lear shows, which teach us that racism is bad and, can't we all get along and just lots of other stuff. And the long arc of media has probably, gone too far in that direction. A lot of people would say, we had kind of the woke phenomenon of the last 10 years. But the difference is something like Saturday Night Live would get 20 million viewers a week, even on a bad week, and now it gets like 2 million. So it's hard to like figure out what actually penetrates the public conscious versus what penetrates elite consciousness, if it's being written about in the New York Times, that used to mean something 30 years ago, and now it might almost be an anti-signal if it's being written there in terms of politics. But I guess another thing I want to throw out as sort of a reason for hope or is kind of the podcast phenomenon. So here in the US, it's been kind of we've talked too much about we need a Joe Rogan for the left or whatever, that's silly. But there are a lot of like really good podcasts about just an astonishing number of topics, right? That have no political valence whatsoever. And I'll just throw out as an example, last night I just happened to listen to an interview with Zadie Smith, the British novelist. She has a book out called The Fraud, which was about, it's a history of this spectacular trial that took place in the 1870s, I think, in Britain. And the guy behind it really was a fraud, but it captured the imagination and led to like real reforms in the British justice system that I won't go into. It's too long to go into here, but here's an example of sort of literary culture, a writer, a very esteemed writer, going onto a podcast. It was actually the Rest is History podcast to talk about this piece of history that was both illuminating and useful, for thinking about politics. And I haven't read her book, and I'm not sure I will read her book, but there's an alternative path to this kind of information.
Yeah,
I think you're making James's point for him. He's horrified that you will listen to the podcast but not read the book.
but there's so much more to it than just the book. I mean,
sure.
She sets the stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think you're right that there used to be very high quality TV, very information heavy, with smart people who were just saying, you had to really concentrate, and that's moved more into podcasts and things. I think that's a good point, but most podcasts are still trash.
Yeah, I sort of become somewhat more skeptical on this. I used to be a real podcast optimist, and I used to think this was I do think podcasts, I guess this is kind of a podcast, have real virtue. It's a good way to get your head around a topic. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I have spoken to people in nonfiction publishing who worry that podcasts are beginning to dent the sales of nonfiction books. And I think there is a mistaken idea that listening to a podcast can replace listening to a book. And for some people, I think for some people it does. I think the length of podcasts is, I used to be more optimistic about the idea that the length of podcasts was a sign that we actually all had attention spans that were there to be activated if we wanted to activate them. And that wasn't dead. I kind of think podcasts are incredibly long and rambling. I'm guilty of this somewhat myself at the moment, because people tune in and out. And a lot of people aren't listening as intently to a podcast as they would concentrate in a book. And it's kind of like background noise, and you listen a bit and you go away and you listen a bit. And it has more in common in TikTok than we'd imagine. The point about television shows in the 70s is a really good one. I'm kind of astonished whenever I look at old stuff on YouTube. The programs I love, Robert Hughes' The Shock of the New, Kenneth Clark's Civilization, John Berger's Ways of Seeing. These like are, almost as complex and as, rich as written texts. And all those series were published as books, and they read very well as books. And this is a point that I guess these media theorists I love, people like Walter Ong, Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman would make, which is that even in the midst of the change of communications technology and the arrival of a new form of media, that doesn't mean that the entire culture changes and adapts itself immediately to the new form of media. So it's not like TikTok was invented. Sure. People started watching it and everyone started sort of like communicating by doing this all the time. We still live to some degree in a culture that has a mode of communication that is still dictated by print. And those TV programs in the 60s and 70s were very much dictated by a culture of print. People spoke like that because they were used to reading magazines and newspapers. That was how they communicated, and it seemed natural that when they made TV shows, that's how they'd communicate too. Neil Postman makes the point really nicely about 19th century conversation and debate, which he says is so influenced by literary culture, so influenced by the culture of print, that people speak in these, to us, preposterously long, elaborate, articulate sentences and multiple subclauses, because that's how people speak in books. And the culture was so saturated in print, people imitated print when they spoke. He says it's true of political debates. People just like stood up and like essentially read out essays to one another, that they just spoke like essays. And I think to some degree, because print was such a powerful force in our culture, and still retains a kind of amazing power just because you'll have to read at school, our cultural experience, even on TikTok and on podcasts, is still conditioned by print to some degree. So it's all good, down to what little good there is down to books.
You can certainly see the decline of the quality of political speeches if you compare Hansard from, say, 1880 to 1980, or it's gotten worse recently, much worse recently. But I would just reiterate the point that a lot of policy making is now not done, on the floor of the House of Commons as it used to be, and that the political skill of reading through a 200-page bill and having meetings with economists and specialists and debating the finer points, it potentially is better for us overall than being able to give a very, very good speech.
Yeah, I think I've dragged you back to pessimism. I think I've killed the little spark of hope that was flickering.
No. I would say the thing. I think you make a good point about TV as well, and I think you see that in film. Right, the first 50 years of Hollywood is a chapter in the history of art, which can't be said for Hollywood more recently, to say the least. Now, Charlotte in the chat has said, haven't popular novels frequently been regarded as frivolous and corrupting throughout much of print history, particularly for women? And quotes Coleridge and other things. I've been writing about this recently, and I think this is a great point actually that James should let's challenge James on this, because there were people writing in right-wing magazines, conservative magazines in the 1790s in the wake of the French Revolution, saying, everyone's reading now, and this is terrible because they're reading all these stupid new ideas coming over from France, all these revolutionaries. They're going to undermine society. They're going to corrupt manners. This is going to be the end of civilization. People reading all sorts of trash books. Oh, these wonderful democratic days when every idiot can read whatever trash he wants to. They're really upset about this, and it's really, really, truly connected to the idea that Jacobin ideas will infiltrate from France as Napoleon wants to invade. And there is a real sense that it's not just sort of young ladies reading novels who might get themselves into a bad marriage. They genuinely are worried that this is undermining the state and undermining social norms. And it's remarkably similar to basically everything you've just said. Only instead of saying they're not reading enough, they're saying, "My God, they're all reading. We must put a stop to this." Does that? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I got to say, I absolutely love this stuff. And you're right about the similarity between the moral panic, especially around novels in the end of the 18th century.
It's remarkably similar, yes.
They were described as an addiction by some people. People worried that kids weren't socializing and they were just lying in bed reading novels. If we think we have a mental health,
and the other thing they said is they would say they come back from these worlds and they're slightly distant from us. And they're still slightly trapped there, as like they've got TikTok face,
And they're dissatisfied with their own lives. I mean, novels were viewed as threatening to the social order because they gave, young women in provincial towns mad ideas about how life should be lived that would disrupt the social order. I mean, it's interesting. It's the theme of literature, the corrupting power of literature. Don Quixote is about a guy who's driven mad by books. Madame Bovary is about a woman whose life is ruined by reading romantic fiction. And yeah, I agree the parallels are fascinating. I just think we can't say that the existence of past moral panics invalidates future moral panics. The fact that people worried about the arrival of books, it doesn't seem to me that it logically follows that we should therefore not worry about the arrival of smartphones. And all the evidence was that in the 18th century, something was called the reading revolution, when people switched from what was called intensive reading, where you might spend your life with like a handful of books that you'd endlessly reread, to extensive reading, where people just began to read vast amounts. This sort of important cultural shift in the 18th century that didn't damage politics. There's a very good book by a lady called Lynn Hunt called The Human Rights Revolution, where she makes the case that novels were the kind of spread of novel reading in the 18th century was a kind of formative part of the development of ideas about human rights. People became accustomed to putting themselves in other people's shoes. People became accustomed to living other people's lives in fiction. And this made them more sort of sympathetic to the idea that everybody had moral value rather than just the people who belong to your caste or class. So I just think it is interesting that these things are similar. It shows that human beings react to, new communications technologies in kind of reliably similar ways. But it just doesn't mean that because everyone was wrong the last time, they're right this time. And I guess arguably you could say if the reading of novels did cause a human rights revolution, as Lynn Hunt argues, that kind of did destroy, that did destroy the society that existed in the 18th century. People blamed Rousseau for the French Revolution. If you're an 18th century aristocrat, you probably had good cause to be worried about the proliferation of novels, because the hierarchical society that you lived in which people at the top had more value than the people at the bottom, to some degree, it seems it probably was degraded by the arrival of novels and reading. I think our society is more just and a much better place to live than Ancien regime France. I would worry much more about its destruction, I think for good reason. And I think there is evidence that the direction that this sort of communications revolution is taking us in is not towards human rights and equality, but away from those things and in the direction of oligarchy and autocracy.
Tyson, you had your hand up. Did you want to?
Yeah. I was wondering, to what extent are we blaming universities as opposed to technology? I sometimes struggle to think that it's all, a slowdown in literacy or reading is all due purely to technology when, just the way from my own experience at school, I was interested in becoming an academic, really. But then I got my toe in that pond, and I saw people writing theses on Harry Potter, for example, or things like the whole critical theory approach to reading, making things extremely boring. And I've actually read some data that shows that people are turning away from contemporary literature back to the classics. So they're not necessarily reading less, they're reading less contemporary fiction. They're reading more, they are actually going back to Dickens and the Brontes and things like that, because there seems to have been over the last 30 years a kind of infusion of kind of nonsense into the way we teach literature in universities. I think in the Anglosphere across the board in America and the UK, like a ratcheting down of seriousness. And I can recall I took a class on Milton at my university. It was one of the top 10 Milton scholars in the world. and the class was absolutely packed. Everybody who was, young people, old people, it just was like a huge class of people who were really hungry to like really study Milton. And then you go to this kind of introductory to American literature class, and it was kind of like lots of patting on the head and what does everybody want to read? And let's look at this through a feminist lens and a Marxist lens. And it was very like, it was kind of soul killing, kind of, it really killed your desire to study literature. And it seems like that's gotten a lot worse. And then they start cutting funding to these programs because kids don't want to do them. So it seems like we got into this pattern of kind of poisoning the well and then cutting the funding, and then each year it gets worse and worse. Does that make sense? Does that seem like a pattern that's
Yeah.
anybody
I
else?
certainly totally agree with that. I mean, I guess, these things are so complex and multifaceted. I think one of the things that's been bad for literature is another social trend that's been going on in the background, which is a kind of suspicion of elite culture, a feeling that a democratic society should be suspicious of things that seem to be enjoyed by people of the superior social class, and that to democratize things, we have to make it easier for people to understand, we have to expand access, and we have to dumb down to get people in through the door. I agree that I think that was a catastrophe for literature, because I think the way that people will get excited about literature and the way that people like us are going to come through the door, and the reason I came through the door was because I thought by reading books, I was accessing something better and superior, that was for smart people, that was for interesting people, that would give me a richer and more profound view of the world. And I think it's those aspects of literature that some departments view as elitist and have become nervous about, and that just kills it, because if you're going to try and make literature as easy as watching television, then why are you reading literature? I think people haven't understood that the argument for literature is that it's like separate and special and above other stuff, which I think is true, and I think that is actually what's attractive about it. Is that's more attractive than trying to dumb it down. I think also the tendency to turn English degrees into a kind of branch of the social studies, where you're skeptical of the canon and you think that's only been constructed to promote the reputations of dead white men, is a real problem for literature. And the idea that the whole enterprise is politically corrupt from the beginning, that this stuff, again, isn't good because it's good. It's good because people with nefarious political views have elevated the stuff that they think is good because it's by other, posh, dead white men. That's really dangerous, because the argument you're making for the subject there is that this stuff is bad for you. Come to my university and, study the morally evil stuff. Seems to me like a terrible argument to make for literature. Why are we studying Milton if he's only there because he was elevated as a dead white man? And I think that's a very, I'm not saying that there's no legitimate criticism of the canon, but it seems like a very dangerous path for universities to go down, because the attraction of literature should be, and was, in the middle of the 20th century, the arguments that were being made in literature departments about the value of literature by people like F.R. Leavis and Lionel Trilling, was that literature was not only intellectually superior, but morally superior. You could feel good about yourself morally for studying literature because it improved you morally. I'm not totally sure how far I buy that. I think there's certainly a case you can make. But if you want to get people to study it, that is a much more compelling argument to make than saying, oh, this stuff is like politically poisoned. And I think that people just go, well, I don't want to study this bad, evil stuff. I
think Leavis did more harm than good in the long run. I'm very anti F.R. Leavis and all this like reading makes you a good person bullshit, because the Leavisites are wrong about a lot of stuff, and they are exposed as actually not being very good at discussing society and the broader issues. And I think that's the poison in the well when it comes to like English gives you critical thinking skills. No, it doesn't. And F.R. Leavis is like the biggest public embarrassment we have about what a lack of critical thinking skills really looks like.
Yes, I mean, I
he
think
also just has terrible opinions, like Dickens isn't a very good novelist and other such atrocities.
He did recant on that.
Not fully. Anyway, I don't want to get angry, but what we're saying is Mark Zuckerberg might be the problem, but Terry Eagleton was much more of it. Boo to Terry Eagleton.
I do think there's an intriguing point there, which is that as soon as you start saying that you should study English literature at university because it's morally improving, then the thing becomes moral improvement, not literature. And that was the thing that in the middle of the last century opened the door to the idea that you went to university to study literature to be morally improved, and then suddenly politics comes in. That's where we are now. I think that's an intriguing intellectual genealogy you can
and that goes back to Matthew Arnold, who was another another huge mistake in the history of English literature.
I mean, the thing is, this stuff is inseparable from the history of literature because, I.A. Richards believed the same thing. Uh, this is kind of baked into
It
English
depends. It
departments.
depends what kind of improvement you think is possible. I think what you see a lot of today that is like the worst example of this is people who think that, as it used to be said by Trilling and others, reading Lolita is a sort of form of training yourself in ethical thinking or whatever, as opposed to like reading the great moral philosophers. Clearly bullshit, but they believe it very strongly. The people who believe that are the ones who will like quote tweet something really rude about a small account who's got like a couple of hundred followers, but who happen to like goad this person in the wrong way. And it's like, wait, the guy telling me that reading novels is like morally improving is like bullying people online. How am I supposed to square this circle? Is that not an argument for saying that reading literature, clearly isn't very good for you at certain levels? I think there's a real problem with with the way literary people behave in public and that claim. And it's not clear to me. It's not clear to me at all that there's a moral distinction between the novel readers and the non-novel readers, as it were. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, just to some degree. I'm a bit suspicious of some of the moral claims made for literature, and the idea that you have this like educated class of people who are morally superior for having been to university and done English degrees. Having met many people who've done English degrees just seems like factually wrong, and also politically troublesome. That
And the
said,
novelists themselves were often bad news.
I don't think that idea comes absolutely from nowhere, and I'm open to being persuaded that it might be true. This Lynn Hunt book, which I've been reading about the role of the novel in the development of human rights, is like undeniably compelling. But I
Sure, sure,
think it
sure.
might be a chicken and the egg thing. I don't think you can ever prove it
I
one way
think
or
what
the
it
other.
is, I think what it is if you read in a certain way, and you read literature in the manner in which, with the attentiveness with which you might bring to moral philosophy or economic history, and you read it alongside those other subjects, it can in fact be part of like moral and intellectual development. But if you have this breathy F.R. Leavis like, I've read Shelley and understood him that he's like bad, therefore I'm on this higher plane and I know things that this sort of Matthew Arnold, like, oh, it gives you access to these higher truths, but I just can't tell you what they are because they're sort of slightly beyond words. But if you're like me, you'll have access to them and culture will improve you and it'll all be very good. At that point, it just becomes like actually corrupting and leads you to think that you're sort of somehow cultivated or that you've enhanced your spirit or you've been nourished by literature. All these words people use, where in fact what you need to do is just pay very close attention and do some real thinking, which may or may not happen when you read George Eliot. Right, we'll look at the chat before we go. There are a couple of things we haven't got to. If there's anything you want to say but haven't, please use the hand emoji now. Jamie says maybe Candy Crush Saga isn't very good, but a lot of people are spending 50 hours or more on Japanese visual novels or reading a 100,000 word screed in a random RPG. I don't really know what this means, but I think he's saying people are consuming a lot of literary type media on their phones. It's not all Candy Crush, or they're reading internet fiction and so forth. So is there some way in which, James, a lot of reading is happening on phones and things, and that it is sort of taking over the role of the book, and it maybe isn't as bad as it looks, I guess is the point.
It was an argument made a lot about 10 years ago when Twitter was in its heyday, and people seem to be spending a lot of time, reading and typing out more text than they ever had done before in history. I'm skeptical even that is the same thing as reading like a long, complex, logically following text, like a novel or a history book. I just don't think it has the same value. I think now these things are a minority way to use the internet. Every platform is pushing its users towards short form video, which, strikes me as like the worst possible direction to go in intellectually. And I think that is there are exceptions, of course, but I think that is the overwhelming and dispiriting direction of travel.
Okay. I didn't think you'd come up with an optimistic answer.
No, I was.
That was quite
Sorry, I didn't even
pessimistic.
need to say it. I could have just sort of, thumbs down.
Yeah,
You
no, very much no. Okay, Katie says, and maybe she will correct me if I get this wrong, that one of the things blocking people reading is basically that we live in a crazy world and we don't really know what to read, and it's a bit isolating when all this stuff is happening. Why would you go and read some book? So what do you do about that? How do you you know, how do you square the problem of like, if I go and read Middlemarch, that's got, you know, be all to do with the crazy state of the world, and it just feels like I'm checking out. I know what my answer is. What's your answer?
Yeah, well, I think I can anticipate the Henry Oliver answer, which I guess I agree with, which is Middlemarch has an awful lot to do with the state of the world and
If you
contains
read
some
it
of the most
correctly.
profound things ever said about the world.
If you read it correctly, if you read it like F.R. Leavis, it's clearly bad for you and you should be on TikTok instead. Is that you have the same opinion or
Yeah, I think I'm on the Henry Oliver position on this
okay.
one.
All right. I think that is all of our comments. If there's anything you haven't said, asked, something you want to disagree with, you're burning with something that we've got wrong, say it now, or you'll have to do it on Twitter where we won't see it because we're closing the discussion. So if anything you want to say, do it now. Otherwise, we say thank you to James for bringing the mood down so well. And we'll see you at the end of civilization when we're all reading books together under a bridge or whatever it
And
is.
thank you very much to you and Anna for having me, and thanks to everyone for watching as well.
Yes, and this
I
was
was ranting on quite a lot, but
no, we're here for your rants. We like
hopefully to some purpose.
yes, thank you to Interintellect because this was their idea, and this is their salon format, which we enjoy so much. And I hope you will all go away and read Jeff Jarvis and Middlemarch and whatever else. Just don't read F.R. Leavis or Terry Eagleton. All right.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thanks for having me.
Cheerio.